In this week's parashah, immediately after the command to create a system of judges throughout the land of Israel, the Torah seems to veer off topic and tells us, Lo titalacha asherah, don't plant an Asherah tree, which was the object of pagan practice. V'lo takim lecha matzeva, and don't build a monument, a matzeva, asher saneh Hashem Elokecha, which the Lord your God despises. It seems to be off topic. But according to Reish Lakish, it's anything but. Because these two commands about an Asherah tree and a matzeva appear where they do in order to teach us that an incompetent judge is as corrupt as a pagan tree. Or as Reb Chaim Soloveitchik Zatzal once explained, an Asherah tree appears to be beautiful and luxurious on the outside, but in essence it's evil and idolatrous. So too, an incompetent judge. He can look sophisticated and dignified, but deep down, his actions pervert justice and create evil, which explains the proximity of these commands against idolatry to the beginning of the parashah. But what about the two commands themselves? Why is the first just giving the facts, while the second, the prohibition of building a monument, described as despicable, despised by God? The answer begins with Rashi, who explains that the matzeva, the monument that is forbidden to be built, was a kind of altar made from a single stone, as opposed to the mizbeach, the type of altar that was made of multiple individual stones. But why would God despise the single stone structure? Wasn't this the kind of altar that our forefathers built? Didn't Yaakov choose specifically to construct a matzeva on the site where he had the dream of the ladder? And didn't Moshe Rabbeinu build 12 matzeva monuments for the 12 tribes of Israel at Har Sinai? Didn't Abraham and Yitzchak also build matzeva altars wherever they traveled? What changed to make the matzeva, once seen as the highest form of tribute to God, so distasteful in his eyes, so that the Torah warned us so strongly against its use? Again, it's Rashi who provides the answer. He explains that the matzeva had become central to Canaanite worship, and that although it had once, during the era of the patriarchs, been so beloved by God, when the Canaanites co-opted this form of worship as their own, it became snuah, abhorrent to the Creator. But still, the Torah could have simply stated, just as it did with the Asherah tree, don't build a matzeva. Why did it have to add the words Asher saneh Hashem Elokecha, which the Lord your God despises? In 1999, Mosad Rav Kook published a collection of sermons that had been delivered between 1893 and 1896 by Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook Zatzal, while he had been serving as the rabbi of Zomel in Lithuania. Rav Kook, whose yahrzeit is this Sunday, had prepared the manuscript for publication. But in the 1920s, it was stolen from his home, only to be returned 40 years later anonymously. Nevertheless, for a variety of reasons, it took 37 more years until finally the book, the Midbar Shur, was published. And in that sefer, Harav Kook explains that each of the forefathers, each of the Avot, represented and embodied a particular midah, a character trait. Avram Avinu personified chesed, kindness. Yitzchak Avinu was the epitome of gvura, of strength, and Yaakov stood for emet, for truth. And each one of them used their own midah in the service of God, and therefore explained Rav Kook that if you would have approached Avraham Avinu and asked him how to draw closer to God, he would have said, do good for others, and you'll achieve this closeness. Because for Avram, chesed was the key to connection. On the other hand, Yitzchak Avinu, he would have advocated for gvura, to have the strength to sacrifice and thereby forge a meaningful relationship with the Almighty. And finally, Yaakov Avinu, he would advise that the path to God requires an unequivocal commitment to emet, because for Yaakov Avinu, truth served as his ultimate compass to find God. In this way, the Avot were unique in their singular approach to God. Why? Said Rav Kook, because it was necessary, since they were creating a nation and they needed to be singularly focused, forging a permanent and solid base. And so a single, solid matzeva, a pillar, was their legacy and their tribute to God. But now, as the Jewish people were about to enter the land of Israel, enter a new phase of peoplehood, God wanted them to be spiritually diversified. To be a Jew in the land of Israel, to be a Jew following the 40 years in the desert meant that we have to strive for chesed, for gvura, and for emet. We had to become a people engaged in meaningful prayer and helping the poor. Be a people who can sacrifice of ourselves and yet give to others. And be a nation who can stand for truth while being able to interact with others who may not share that value. As a result, the single stoned matzeva, which was once acceptable and even desirable, was to be no more. God demanded instead a mizbeach avanim, a multi-stone, multifaceted altar, because more than anything else, God never wants us to sell ourselves short, never wants us to think that we're limited and can't be more, never wants us to think that there's only one way. Said God, the single stone, the single approach, matzeva, which gives man a license to be one thing, is asher sanem, is something I cannot tolerate because I despise when you convince yourselves that you can't be more. There are two paths we face in life: the singular approach or the multivaried approach. The matzeva versus the mizbeach avanim. And our parasha teaches us that to fulfill our promise and draw closer to God, we must accumulate stones by seeking God while engaging his creations. To be just one, to seek spirituality without wisdom, to do acts of kindness without acts of service can never be our way, which is also what this new month of Chodesh Elul is all about. It's the time that's for God, as its acronym of Ani L'Dodi V'Dodi Li, I am for my beloved and my beloved is for me, reminds us. But it's also a time for others, as its other acronym, Ish L'Re'eu Matanot Le'Avyonim, of turning to one another and providing for the poor, also reminds us. 40 days, 40 steps, and so many stones along the way that need to be collected and used to build our monument to God. May these days expand the ways we seek God, diversifying our paths, gathering the stones, and creating a mizbeach avanim for God, as God truly wants. Shabbat Shalom and Chodesh Tov.